Hi everyone, so this is Invasion Ecology Lecture 5, continuing on the topic of why is it that some species that are introduced successfully establish, spread, and become invasive. That idea that there are lots of species that are introduced and only a portion of those, especially if we're talking about plants, only a small portion of those go on to become invasive. The red guy that's outlined on here is Lantana camara, and problematic invasive species in South Asia. The rest of them, not so bad. Accompanying reading for this lecture is the Keane and Crawley review paper on the enemy release hypothesis. So we'll be talking about that more in class as well. And so we're going to be talking about these hypotheses number 4 and 5 today. So that invasive species succeed because they're released from their natural enemies, and invasive species might succeed because they have a set of traits that just makes them bigger, faster, stronger, and more able to establish, spread, outcompete native species. So we'll start with that enemy release hypothesis. So you might remember this figure from the MAC paper that you read at the beginning of class. This is that comparison of the two shrub species, the chrysanthemoides that is native to South Africa and introduced in Australia, and the acacia native to Australia and introduced in South Africa. And that observation that for both of these two shrubs in their native range in the blue, they produce a goodly number of seeds that survive and could go on to reproduce. But in their non-native range, they produce way more viable seeds than they do in their native range. And so the hypothesis for why that's happening is because fewer critters are eating the seeds in the non-native range, because those critters that would have eaten the seeds have been left behind in the native range and not been introduced along with these shrubs into South Africa or into Australia. So the idea behind the enemy release hypothesis is that you are released, if you're a plant, from herbivory. If you're an animal, you're released from other pests and pathogens that would attack you. So from a plant, I'm going to be talking mainly from a plant perspective, but the advantage to a plant, right, is if you are a non-native plant and things are not eating you, then you can use your resources to grow more leaves, more roots, more shoots, more flowers, and thereby be more competitive and more successful in your non-native range. So there's a counter to this, right? So this might favor some species. Conversely, there might be biotic resistance, which is basically you get introduced to a new range, the new herbivores, new predators in that region are like, oh, there's a tasty snack that I've never sampled before. They go and eat you, and so you're unsuccessful at establishing and colonizing a new range. So for in invasion ecology and in much of ecology, there is often a hypothesis and a counter hypothesis. So for some species, your release might be a good thing because nothing in that non-native range wants to eat you. For other species, you may find yourself in really hazardous new territory with lots of species wanting to eat you. So the life of a plant, and again, focusing on plants, but this is true of animals as well. The life of a plant is that you are constantly under attack, whether that's from herbivores like insects, other invertebrates, vertebrates, whether it is from fungal attack, other pathogen attack. You are constantly susceptible to being eaten. And there's an important piece of the enemy release hypothesis, which is that there's an important distinction between what's eating you, whether that is a specialist being something that eats you and only you, or you and your congeners, so other species of the same genus, but only that genus. So there's different levels of specialization down to the species, to the genus, to the family, whatever it is. Or there's species like humans that can eat anything, unless you're gluten intolerant. Generalists though, right? So generalists are like humans, eat anything, or if you're an insect or a pathogen, might attack multiple different species. So in this chart here, you can see that the Japanese beetle, which is one on the left, is attacking all of these different species of flowers. Let's call them different species of flowers. So that is a generalist insect attacker, generalist herbivore. But the blight or the fungus on the right side, I'm actually not sure what that is, but the one on the right side is only attacking the orange flower. So the left side is the most generalist, all the way to the right side, which is the most specialist. And of course, there's stuff in between, like the the insect attacking the corn might attack corn and one other crop, for example. Right, so the specialists only eat one thing or a small range of things. Generalists eat lots of things. It's another way. If you were a specialist, then you would only eat one thing. An important thing to realize is that most insect pests and pathogens, and when we're talking about enemies, most of what we're talking about are insect pests and pathogens. I mean, there are deer out there, but there's one deer and like a bazillion insects and pathogens attacking things. So most of what we're talking about in terms of enemies are insect pests and pathogens. When you are, regardless of what you are, whether you're a plant or animal, pathogens tend to be the most important for plants. Insect herbivores certainly start ranking up there, but there's lots of insects that attack other insects too. So most of those species, most of those enemies are specialists. So that means that they specialize on a single species or a small set of closely related congeneric species, or a small set of closely related species in the same family, but they don't eat anything. They just eat, these things that they have evolved to specialize on. So here's our happy ecosystem in the native range. You've got a couple of different trees, and a generalist is eating both of those trees, and then you've got a whole host of specialists lined up to eat just those specific trees. So our study species is the one on the left. So this is in its native range. If you introduce it into its non-native range, so this is my adoption of the figure from Keane and Crawley, then that native species still has all of its specialist enemies lined up there eating it, but the study species has left behind all or a majority of its specialist enemies. So, if you are a nursery breeder, for example, trying to cultivate this tree, you don't want all of those enemies coming with it. You don't want the blight from the native range along with it. So you're going to choose your stock so that it's uninfected, it doesn't have insect larvae or pests or whatever on it, and you're going to bring it over and try to cultivate it in this new range. And so the idea is that because you don't have these things attacking you, you can, the study species, grow bigger, faster, stronger. You can outcompete those natives, so that's sort of the thicker arrow pointing from left to right. And then there's also this hypothesis in there that even though the generalists eat a lot of things, that actually confronted with something totally new, that most generalists will prefer the thing that they've already been eating. So that's a little bit of a question mark, but the hypothesis is that the generalist will probably consume more of your native competitors than the new introduced species. So great if you're a plant and those specialist herbivores have been removed. And this is a little bit of an aside, but this enemy release is not only true of invasive species, but it's also true of non-native and non-invasive species too. So this actually tells you in invasion ecology that enemy release is not the sole reason that species can go on to become invasive, because we see an enemy release in plenty of non-native plants as well. And this graph is basically showing comparison of the numbers of insectivorous, insect-eating, and more generalist omnivorous birds in a native garden on the left versus a garden planted mostly with non-native species. And what you're seeing is that there's a much higher bird abundance, so numbers of birds, as well as richness, numbers of species of birds, if somebody's garden is planted predominantly with native species. And the reason behind that, the mechanism behind that, is because those non-native plants support fewer insects. So if you have this conventional non-native garden with, I don't know, lots of azaleas from Asia and rhododendrons from Asia and stuff like that, there are fewer insects that you're supporting because those specialist insects like native plants, they don't like rhododendrons. And because birds, especially juvenile birds, so birds that are feeding their offspring, their nestlings, primarily feed them on insect protein, they're going to do a lot better if you've got plants in your garden that are supporting native insects. And so the result of this, if you're interested in gardening one of these days, is to plant native in your garden because the non-native gardens support way fewer birds. All right, that was a little bit of an aside. Here's some evidence of enemy release more broadly in different plants that have naturalized. So those are ones that have at least established in a non-native range outside of human cultivation. And the important thing on here is to notice where the 1-to-1 line is, right? So the line at the 45-degree angle going up. If you are a dot, and this is 473 naturalized plants, right? So if you are a dot that is on that line, then that means, so let's take the left one, for example, that means that you have the same number of fungi attacking you in the native range as in the naturalized range if you're here, or something like that. Same number, about 12 in both of those cases, right? But the actual data are all way down here, right? So that tells you that most plants that have naturalized someplace new have way more fungi attacking them in their native range than they do in their naturalized range. So evidence for an enemy release. And the same is true, although not quite as much, for viruses, and largely because there just aren't as many viruses that are attacking plants, way more fungal pathogens attacking plants. So the last one was plants. The same is true for animals. Again, this is native versus the naturalized or introduced range. And we're looking at parasite species richness. So again, richness is the numbers of different species of parasites. And then prevalence is the amount of, the abundance of those parasites. And they've normalized all of these to go from 0 to 1. But essentially that 1-to-1 line again would mean you've got the same number of parasites attacking you in your native and in your non-native range. But what we see is most of the points fall below the 1-to-1 line, which tells us that at least for these 26 species, that most of those species have more parasites attacking them in their native range than in their non-native range. Again, evidence in animals for an enemy release happening. So one of the management strategies that you read about a little bit in the MAC article, we'll talk a little bit more about management towards the end of the class, but one important management strategy is biological control. So here's a quote from Van Drijs and Bellows from '96, where biological control is the use of parasitoid, predator, pathogen, antagonist, or competitor populations to suppress a pest population, which makes it less abundant and thereby less damaging than it would otherwise be. So the goal is not necessarily to eliminate an invasive species, it is to bring the population down so that it is no longer problematic. And this graph at the bottom is essentially showing the ideal scenario where you have, in this case, a biocontrol agent for a plant pest, so a weed, and that weedy species has a high population density. You release the biocontrol agent in the gray, and basically what it does is it brings the invasive plant density down to something that is less damaging and thereby allows the native vegetation to better compete against those and, you know, go back to a more desirable ecosystem. But so one of the reasons that we would hypothesize that biological control would be effective is because an enemy release is happening, right? So if part of why an invasive species is successful is because they're released from the native specialist predators, then reintroducing one of those should be effective at reducing the overall population. Next hypothesis and last hypothesis that's sort of a major one, I think, in invasion ecology is that invasive species have some sort of unique traits that favor the establishment and spread of the species. And you're going to do some more with traits for some different taxa in the next team exercise. So we'll have a chance to dig into this a little bit more. But this one I feel like is pretty intuitive, you know, so what traits are likely to favor an invasive species? So you could probably pause for a second and think of a few that would intuitively come to the top of your head of, yeah, I've seen some invasive species out there, and here are some traits that that I think would help them to either be brought over, to establish, to invade, to have impact. So here are some examples of ones that favor invasive plants, or that we think favor invasive plants based on a fair bit of evidence that people have looked at comparing invasive to non-invasive plants. One is fecundity. So fecundity being that production of seeds or plant parts. So the more seeds you produce, the more propagules you produce, the more likely you are to be invasive. And I should say that a lot of these traits of plants go back quite a ways in terms of hypotheses. So there was a 1974 paper by Baker who laid out the qualities or traits of the ideal weed. Another trait of an invasive plant is rapid growth. So here's Japanese knotweed, someplace in Alaska where it has grown really tall and pretty fast. So you don't see much of other vegetation mass amongst that near monoculture of Japanese knotweed. So if you grow faster, more likely to outcompete native species, more likely to be invasive. Here's one that's more of a newer trait that's been associated with invasive plants. So not going back to Baker's ideal weed, but you know, in the last 10, 15 years, as climate has been changing, we've been noticing a lot of things happening to invasive plant populations that might be due to the changing climatic landscape. And one of these traits that seems to favor invasive plants is something called phenological plasticity. So phenology refers to repeated biological events. So a phenological event could be the time when chickadees lay their eggs, the time when cottonwoods release their seeds, those types of things. So one important phenological event is when a plant flowers. And phenological plasticity refers to essentially flexibility in when that thing happens. So if you are phenologically plastic, then you are going to be more responsive to these changes in climate conditions, and that particular trait is associated with invasiveness. So this thing at the bottom is showing how much over the 1900s, so from 1900 to the early 2000s, this article, which is really cool, looked at essentially botanical records of when plants had were flowering in history based on when they were pressed into collection books. So if you're a botanist and you're going out to collect plants. The best time to collect them is when they're flowering because that helps you identify them really well. And you press them into a book and you end up with these botanical records going back to the early 1900s. And each of those records has where you collected it, the date on which you collected it. And so this study was actually able to look at trajectories through time of how the timing of flowering had shifted over this 100-year time period and compare it to climate change. And one of the interesting things that they found associated with the native versus invasive was that invasive species, so the two that are in red here, invasive species had shifted their flowering time earlier in the spring or earlier in the season by an average of 10 or 11 days relative to native species, which had mostly stayed about the same through that 100-year period. Natives and non-natives that were not invasive, natives, non-natives, they were doing the same thing. It was just these invasive species that had shifted their flowering time back significantly. That's what the little star means relative to everything else. So if you are able to shift in response to all the other changes that are going on, that gives you an advantage, makes you more likely to be invasive. Another trait that favors invasive plants is broad environmental tolerance. So this is from a paper that was comparing a bunch of species from the same genus or family and looking at the ones within that, so close relatives of those, which ones were introduced but not naturalized, which ones were naturalized but not invasive, and which ones were all three of those things, introduced, naturalized, and invasive. So the purple one, which is the invasive one, is much to the right. So projected range size basically means, based on this model of all of the distribution data that we have for that species, how broad is the native range of that invasive species. And you can see that as you have a broader native range, you are more likely to be naturalized and more likely to be invasive. So tolerate a lot of environments and you get introduced someplace, the odds are you might end up in a place that works well for you. Another thing that's worth thinking about in terms of traits, which I think is really fascinating, is that your traits are going to vary through the different stages of invasion. So the traits that would help you survive transport from one place to another might be very different from the traits that are going to help you spread and have impact once you arrive. So this makes it really hard to figure out, well, what are the traits that make a species invasive, because it kind of depends which stage you're looking at. And this is where that propagule bias that we talked about in the last lecture and when we were talking about the Ecology article, that's where that creeps in a little bit, because we select from all of these different species out there a subset that we decide to transport. Those tend to be ones that we like, or ones that for whatever reason are associated with humans. So they might be agricultural weeds, for example, and they just come along with our seed banks or something. So here's the question, right? Seed longevity. We talked about that a little bit in the last lecture, but seed longevity just is how long your seed lasts for, how long it's good for, right? Can it tolerate being in cruddy conditions for several months before it gets introduced someplace? And then can it actually establish a population once it's been introduced after that long transport time? So why might seed longevity make a plant more likely to become invasive? Effectively because of this transport time period, not necessarily because that's a great trait for establishment or spread. If you're already there, you don't need your seed to last for a really long time, but in order to get there, you kind of do. So all of these ideas about traits, that there might be some traits that would favor a plant or an insect or whatever it is to become invasive, also lead into what are called weed risk assessment protocols. So this is the protocol from the APHIS, so that Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, their plant protection and quarantine, or PPQ protocol. And the reason that this thing exists is because most plants are brought over as ornamental species. They're brought over intentionally. And if they're brought over intentionally, then that means that there's an actor, you know, whether a horticulture industrialist, if that's a word, who's bringing that plant over. And that means that the USDA could say to that person, before you bring this new plant over, let's assess it based on its traits and see if it has similar traits to these other species that are known to be invasive. So this is just a whole list of the establishment and spread potential of an invasive species that you could evaluate if you know the specific species that's being brought over. Risk assessments really don't work for an unintentional pathway because we don't know what's coming, so there's really no way to evaluate it or tell, and people aren't introducing them deliberately, so there's no person or actor importer that we could go to say, let's do this assessment on that species. So starting next class, you are going to be focused on that question of whether there are traits that are common either within or across groups of invasive species. So you're going to be looking at different taxa again, just like you did for the first exercise on pathways, to see if you can find these common traits. And again, just as a reminder, for the class that this lecture accompanies, we are also going to be talking about the Keane and Crawley paper. So please take a look through that. Make sure you do the quiz questions before class, and I will see you in class.